Okay, welcome back to members of 121 Community Church in Grapevine, Texas, to our men's group study and to our study in the Gospel of John. And today what we're going to do is we're going to finish up chapter 7. We're going to wrap up chapter 7 all the way to verse 53, and we're going to launch our study into chapter 8. And we're at a point now where we've got Jesus teaching in the temple during the Feast of Tabernacles, and we're going to find that Jesus used elements of the festival for signs of his own ministry and the signs of his own being. And so we're going to take a look at the triad on the left. We're going to look at 7:37 through 53, and we're going to take a look at the teaching of Jesus on the last day of the feast. Remember, the previous teaching was on the Sabbath of the festival. Well, now we're looking at the last day of the festival. And what we need to understand is that what Jesus did is he would teach during the day. We learn this from the Synoptic Gospels. He would teach during the day, and then in the evening he would return through the Garden of Gethsemane, up the Mount of Olives, and then down the other side of the Mount of Olives to the house of Lazarus, Martha, and Mary in Bethany. So in order to get from Jerusalem to Bethany, you pass through Gethsemane and the Mount of Olives. And so it was a 2-mile trek, 1 mile up, and then 1 mile down, and the same thing when going back into Jerusalem for the next morning's teachings. But he would teach during the day and then return to Bethany in the evening. So let's pick up that left triad. We're going to look at block 1, which is going to be 37, 38, and 39. And it is the last day of the feast, the 8th day, which is the day of the assembly, the solemn assembly. And for 7 days, the priest would fetch water in a golden pitcher from the pool of Siloam to pour on the west end of the altar of sacrifice. And that was to ceremonially remember the rock in the wilderness that gave forth water when Moses struck it. That's from Numbers 20:11. So it's a way to remember from the 40 days of wandering, from the 40 years of wandering in the wilderness, that God did provide water for them and did provide for them and protect them during the 40 years of wandering. And so that gold pitcher would be used to retrieve water from the pool of Siloam, and that would be poured on the west end of the altar of sacrifice. And then in 1 Corinthians 10:4, we see that Jesus Christ is the rock in the wilderness during the Exodus that gave water. He is the true rock in the wilderness of the new Exodus that gives forth the living water. Now on the 8th day, Jesus himself becomes the pitcher of gold. They did it for 7 days, but on the day of the solemn assembly, the 8th day, they did not do the water sacrifice. They did it for 7 days straight. On the 8th day, they didn't. And on the 8th day, Jesus takes up the role of being the pitcher of gold. Now in Zechariah 14:17 through 19, the Feast of Tabernacles is associated with the blessing of rain, because the Feast of Tabernacles was a time of when the harvest was in for the spring and summer harvest, but the fall planting was out, and Israel was waiting and praying for the rains for the fall crops, for the fall planting. And so those who participated in the Feast of Tabernacles were promised rain from the Lord for their crops. Those who failed to participate, those nations would be cursed by not receiving rain. So it was associated with the blessing of rain and the universal rule of the Messiah to come. Now on the 8th day, the priest also compassed or walked around the altar of sacrifice 7 times. That symbolized the taking of Jericho when the walls of Jericho fell down, and that was the moment of the end of the wanderings, when that was their victorious entrance into the Promised Land. So symbolically, the priest would circle the altar 7 times to symbolically represent this end of the 40 years of wandering. And then number 7, Christ identifies himself with this deep meaning of this feast. He is the well of salvation mentioned in Isaiah 12:3. We see Jesus standing somewhere in the temple where the priest must have exited to go to the pool of Siloam with the pitcher of gold and then come back in. So somewhere he stood between that trajectory, that place of traverse between the pool and the altar. And while he stood there, if we notice in note 2 that on the last day of the festival, Jesus loudly cried out his invitation to living water. He yells out, "Whoever desires should turn and come to him and receive and drink the living water." And so he basically says that for salvation, we need to seek, to turn, and to receive. And for those believing in him, he offers the flowing spiritual water. Those who have pisteuo, true faith, then he says, ek kolia, out of the depth of his being, will be given the flow of living water. And a believer will receive an overflow of living water with a surplus of spirit. And we're told that this is said of the Spirit which would be given after his ascension unto glory. Because we know after the ascension, that is when the Comforter was given on the day of Pentecost. And that is promised here in a prophetic way, that would be given after his ascension unto glory. But it's basically his symbolic way of speaking of the Spirit, which believers will receive after Jesus ascends to the doxazo glory. Jesus Christ is the doxa glory of God. So he says, "Come and drink from me. I am the living water." He invites the people to come to him for the living water, which he speaks during this time of the priest walking back and forth with the gold pitcher between the pool of Siloam and the altar of sacrifice. But he's trying to illustrate that he is the living water of the new Exodus, and he is the provision of spiritual nourishment in the new covenant, as opposed to the old covenant, when Moses struck the rock and water came forth. So Jesus uses that analogy, he uses that symbolic rite to be taken up in his sermon on and his invitation to faith as the giver of the living water. But we're going to see that he got a mixed reaction to that, because after making this proclamation in these 3 verses of 37 through 39, we see in the second block that there was a mixed reaction to his proclamation. And it split between some. Half of the crowd called him a prophet, but there were a small percentage, who actually did recognize him and declare him the Christos, the Christ. And so for our theological insights, the prophet referred to, because half did say he was a prophet, and the prophet that they are thinking of is the one of Deuteronomy 18:15. In other words, a prophet of one like unto Moses. This is the deliverer. They're perceiving that Jesus is the deliverer prophet, the prophet like unto Moses, who would deliver them from oppression, deliver them from the oppression of Rome, but also they needed to be delivered from the oppression of false Judaism that was truly oppressive, especially according to Jesus and his rebukes. But they were looking at Jesus as a prophet, as one like unto Moses. And in Micah 5:2, that's where the Messiah is prophesied to come out of Bethlehem. But some of the Aklas crowd, now this is the crowd that was not the citizens of Jerusalem. The Aklas crowd are those from the visiting outside villages. Some of those declared that he's a prophet. Others within that crowd declared he is the Christos Messiah. So there was a schism, there was a split or a separation of opinion between this Aklas crowd of the villagers that were there for the Feast of Tabernacles. Half felt like he was a prophet like unto Moses, but some did actually take the leap of faith and say, no, this is the Messiah, this is the Christ. And that leads us to the reaction of the Sanhedrin in 44 through 53. And according to John the Apostle, they are still trapped in confusion. The guards come back to the Sanhedrin, and they have not arrested Jesus, and they proclaim that no one has spoken like this one before. So we notice that the testimony of the guards is significant because they are more apt not to be so introspective and reflective concerning the Christ. But in Deuteronomy 1, 16 through 17 is a requirement that one must be heard from before judgment can be pronounced. Because remember, Nicodemus was one of the Pharisees, and he didn't think that they should jump to judgment without obeying the law of Deuteronomy 1, 16 and 17. And the Sanhedrin also did proclaim that no prophet comes out of Galilee, but in our third theological insight, in 2 Kings 14:25, we see that Jonah truly was out of Galilee. So there was a messenger of God who did come out of Galilee in the Old Covenant. It was Jonah. So when Jesus is not arrested, the temple guard proclaimed that no man has spoken like this before, never expressed himself like this. The Pharisees continued their falsehood by saying that the guards have been deceived by the deceiver. The Sanhedrin still uses that concept of a planao, that Jesus is a deceiver. He is a evil deceiver in their eyes because he opposes their false Judaism. But these self-righteous Pharisees are also unkind to the crowd. They end up calling the crowd ignorant and cursed. They call them me gnosko, unable to learn, to know. And they call them cursed. So they also, this flock that they're supposed to be spiritually guiding, they look down on them as ignorant and cursed. Now Nicodemus is the one who protests this rapid jumping to judgment, and he says no man can be judged until he's heard from first. You can't judge him until you first hear him. And so our procedure should be hear first, then learn from listening, and then form a judgment. And that's when the Sanhedrin answer Nicodemus and say that prophets do not rise up out of Galilee. However, in Matthew 12:38 to 41, Jesus calls himself one like unto Jonah. Remember when he was speaking to the Jewish leadership, he says, no sign will be given except the sign of Jonah, and one greater than Jonah is with you now. But Jesus compared himself to Jonah, and it is significant because Jonah did come out of Galilee. So we've got the reference to a prophet who did indeed come out of Galilee, but the Sanhedrin were unwilling to admit that. So we find that the Sanhedrin are left in confusion. We've got the crowd split in opinion between thinking that Jesus is a prophet like unto Moses, or that yes, he might indeed be the Christos Messiah, but the Sanhedrin are adamant on being opposed to Jesus. They are determined that he is a deceiver, and that he is a deceiver because he opposes their version of Judaism and their rabbinic laws and rites for the Sabbath. And so they still oppose him, and they are still trapped in confusion. But we have to remember that the procedure here is Jesus teaches during the day, then he retreats to the Mount of Olives in the evening, and probably has a devotional time on the top of the Mount of Olives. It was about at 2,000 feet. It wasn't super high, but it was still an elevated point. It was about 2,000 feet. But he would have a prayer and meditation time with the Father on the top of the Mount of Olives, and then he would descend down to Bethany to where he stayed with Lazarus, Martha, and Mary. The brothers and sisters, he truly loved that family. I think it's just amazing that he truly loved and selected these good people to stay with and to share meals with. It's just a tremendous testimony to their love and to their commitment to Jesus. And so when we go to the block on the right and pick up chapter 8, we are going to be looking at exactly that situation. We have the situation where Jesus leaves and goes to the Mount of Olives. Then he's going to return the following morning to teach again. So we're going to pick that up in the triad on the right. So we've had our teaching somewhere in the courtyard on the last day of the feast, when Jesus compares himself to the living water in the wilderness that nourishes the people. But now he's going to teach again, but he's going to teach and take up the signification or the sign of light. We're going to look at John 8, 1 through 43, and 1 through 16. Jesus is the light of the world. And for our theological insights, you can compare Luke 21, 37 and 38. During the day, Jesus taught in the temple. That's that Luke reference that you need out of the synoptics. During the day, he taught in the temple. In the evening, he went to the Mount of Olives, which he had to go to the Mount of Olives because that was directly his path to the house in Bethany. But for our new Exodus analogy, we're going to take a look at Jesus Christ as the light of the new Exodus. In Zechariah 14, 4 through 7, the Mount of Olives is where the resurrection of the dead was to begin. The Israelites believed where the evening time will become light, and the resurrection will begin on the Mount of Olives. Jesus always passed through Gethsemane, which is at the base of the Mount of Olives, then up over the Mount of Olives, and then on to Mary of Bethany's house, where he stayed. In Isaiah 9, 1 and 2, it prophesies that Jesus will be the light that conquers the shadow of death in Jerusalem. Now, it's interesting here that in this teaching, Jesus is going to speak in the court of women. It's the inner court, but it's the first inner court, the court of women. And in that first court, that first inner court, there were 75-foot candelabras with 4 oil bowls to each. And they would light those oil bowls during the Feast of Tabernacles, and being 75 feet high, they would actually create a glow above the temple that could be seen from Jerusalem. Anywhere in Jerusalem, you could look at the sky, you see that golden glow above the temple during the Feast of Tabernacles. It was from these giant candelabras that had the oil bowls lit and that were 75 feet high. This is the place where Jesus stands to teach. He actually sits to teach this time, but this is where he teaches now. He teaches in the inner courtyard, but it's the first inner courtyard. It is the court of women. And so, number 5, Jesus Christ is the pillar of fire of the new Exodus from Exodus 13:21, who will lead the people out of the shadow of false Judaism. So he's going to lead them out of the wilderness, but in the new covenant, he's leading them out of the wandering in the wilderness of false Judaism. And he is the pillar of fire. He is light, guiding light, and he's standing in the room. He's standing in the courtyard of light, the courtyard of the candelabras. He always picks up a signification within the immediate vicinity. So before he was picking up the pitcher of gold for living water, and now he's picking up the candelabras in the court of women. So note too, Jesus returns to the temple to teach again. He sits down in the court of women, which is also the treasury. He sits down and he teaches. Now Jesus makes a bold statement that he is the light of the world that brings life over darkness. He is the Phos, the spiritual light manifesting God's essence of the cosmos, of all creation. And he conquers the Scotia spiritual darkness with the Zoe spiritual life. So it's a tremendously powerful statement that you are the light of God's essence. And the Pharisees recognize this, and they declare that Jesus is making false witness. He is making a martyreo uk alethes. He's making a witness of not truth, a false witness. But Jesus declares that they do not know where he is from or where he will return. And because of where he is from, his witness is not false. His witness is true. And that's going to take us on to block 2, and in block 2 we're going to look at the verses 17 through 29, and in 17 through 29 we've got the those of false Judaism will die in their sins. And for our theological insights, his witness satisfies the Mosaic law of Deuteronomy 17:6 and 19:15, where it says that that 2 together constitutes a legitimate witness. And then number 2, the confession of the centurion in Luke 23:47 is an example of the awareness that can come at viewing the crucifixion, even without the resurrection, just through viewing the crucifixion and Jesus' abandonment on the cross. And then number 3, the court of women included the treasury along the walls where the trumpet funnels were located. And I've got a little subsystem here. We're going to take a look at the treasury. It contained 13 trumpet-shaped funnels against the walls for offerings to cover the expenses for the following. Each trumpet was specifically designated. 1 and 2 were for the half-shekel temple tax. 3 was for turtle dove offerings. 4 was for pigeon offerings. 5 was for the altar wood for the fire. 6 was for the incense for prayer offerings. 7 and 8 were for maintaining the golden vessels and for worship expenses. And 9 through 13 were for general fund donations. So in note 2, Jesus says he represents a witness of 2, not 1, because he has himself as a witness and the Father who sent him. And that does satisfy Deuteronomy 19:15. And he says that these Pharisees do not know him. There's that eidos again. They do not self-consciously or spiritually even come close to knowing him. But he's not arrested here in the court of women. And again, we learn from the Apostle John that it is because his hour has not yet come. His hour has not yet come. Therefore, the Sanhedrin are held back from arresting him. But this time, the rebuke of expulsion from Jesus includes the strong statement, extremely strong statement, that they will die in their sins. They will die in their hamartia sins. Not only can they not go where he goes, they cannot go to heaven, they cannot go to where he will return, but also they will die in their sins. They are from the world below, he is from the world above. They are from the below world, the kata cosmos, and he is from the eno cosmos. Jesus says he teaches what he hears from the Father, and therefore what he hears from the Father is genuine and true and real, and he teaches what he hears from the Father. And interestingly, in verse 27, the Apostle John does tell us that the Pharisees did gnosko, learn a little. They did begin to learn about what Jesus was pointing to. There was just the beginning of a little bit of a birth of awareness and learning in verse 27, according to the Apostle John. But this knowing through learning will finally occur when the Christ is raised up on the cross. Then, like the centurion, they shall recognize him. So, once the Son of Man is raised up, then they will gnosko, learn fully in his abandonment on the cross that he truly is the Son of Man, come to redeem the world as Messiah. But interestingly, Jesus also says in this section that the Father remains with him even in his sending for the salvation of the creation. The Father, even though the Father has sent him, he has not released him. That's an interesting statement. It says that uk ephemai, that the Father has not let go of me. He has sent me into the world, but he has not let go of me. Now we know that he is going to let go of him on the cross when Jesus Christ must actually suffer abandonment by the Father for all of those in creation. He will suffer abandonment, so there will be a point when the Father will let go. But at this point, Jesus says, the Father has sent me into the world, but he has not completely let go of me. We are still connected. We are still in constant communion. He has not let go of me. But the tragic truth is that we know on the cross, Jesus will suffer abandonment and God-forsakenness for our benefit and for our salvation. But he tells the Sanhedrin that the Father is with me. The Father has sent me into the world. I come down from heaven, but I am still in constant communion with the Father. So our Pharisees remain trapped in confusion. We're told that many do believe after hearing Jesus proclaim that he is the light of the world. And so Jesus turns to those who do believe, and he gives a definition for discipleship. In verse 31, he says that discipleship means abiding in my word. Abide in my logos, logos, amos, abide in my word, and you will be my disciples. And you will receive spiritual freedom and release from bondage of sin. Because everyone who practices sin becomes a slave to sin. But Christ's truth abides unto the future age. And then Jesus, in the same teaching, turns toward the Sanhedrin. But he says, but you Pharisees do not have a place, you don't make a place in your hearts for my logos. You don't make a place there for my word. But you should make a place for my word, because what I speak is that which I have seen of my Father. That which I have seen of my Father is that which I speak. You should make room in your hearts for my word because of this, because they are the words of the Father. He speaks what he has seen of the Father. But Jesus pronounces that tragic conclusion. They are trapped in confusion. And he says in verse 43, they have lost their spiritual potential. Their dunamai, they do not have that potential spiritual power. And they will not learn. They gnosko, they will not learn. And they do not have the dunamai, potential power of the Holy Spirit because of that. And they do not know the Father. They are trapped in confusion. So this is a continuation of that trajectory toward the passion of Christ that we talked about. We're in that area where we're moving from the Feast of Tabernacles to the upcoming Passover, when Jesus will become the Paschal Lamb. And because of that, we have this confrontation again and again and again between Jesus and the Sanhedrin, between Jesus and the false Judaism, the oppressive false Judaism that needs a deliverer like unto Moses to lead them into a new exodus, unto the freedom from the bondage of sin. And that's going to wrap up our study up through chapter 8:43.